Hello, everyone, and welcome to the presentation today. It's Company Podcast Success, presented by Castos and myself, Matt Medeiros, Director of Podcaster Success here at Castos. If you're in the audience and you're thinking, boy, my company could use a podcast. It could use kind of a few podcasts, but let's just say maybe a public-facing podcast or a private podcast. And we'll talk about the two differences today, primarily public, of course, being that sort of marketing, brand awareness tool to reach and engage your potential customers and maybe partners. And a private podcast, which is used to inform and communicate and collaborate with your internal teams and stakeholders across your company. Largely, many of us working from home, of course, these days, and companies looking for new and innovative ways to get educational content and HR content and enablement content to their employees. Turning to audio is a fantastic way and a fantastic vehicle to get that out to your employees. Let's talk about goal setting, everyone's favorite topic with any initiative that they're doing at their company. Goal setting for both public and private. So if we're looking at goals specifically for a private podcast, one might ask themselves, well, I want to enrich the employee onboarding experience, or I need more material for training and enablement, health and wellness. Health and wellness, again, with so many people working from home, this sort of step-away experience that we've crafted at Castos with our private podcasting tools is phenomenal, because what you're encouraging people to step away from the desk, quite literally, take the content on the road with them, whether it's for a jog or to the gym or to just clean the house, step away, walk away, reset, and engage that way is an amazing tool for health and wellness. Engagement, internal communications, of course, and async meetings, also part of the step away experience. Hey, we don't have to be in these meetings anymore. Maybe we're actually recording meetings. So if you miss a meeting, that's okay. We'll record the meetings in Zoom and send them to our private podcast, and folks can consume the information there. There's no rules with audio. It's up to your creativity. Goal setting for public podcasts, of course, like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, brand awareness, content marketing, selling products and services, subscription and membership revenue, if you have a membership or a course, and of course, educational content that you might be selling. Fantastic way to either deliver your primary value, your core value, through audio, or supplemental information and content right through audio as well. So fantastic ways to think about your goals for your public podcast. And of course, the goals we're going after, but how are we going to measure the success of both public and private? There's two ways for both public and private. And a lot of us think of it in the same regard. If we're looking at private podcasts, the standard success milestones is adoption at launch. Right? What do we want to see happen in the beginning, especially if you're not, if this is the first time you've gone into audio for your private podcast, for your company podcast? We want to reach for a goal of adoption at launch. That's all we really have to ask for. For when we're doing private audio, generally it's that awareness. It's, did they take a test? Did they get certified? Did they listen to the meeting notes? That kind of thing. And that's all fine and well. We're going to get there. But in the beginning, in the early stages, we look for a 10 to 20% adoption. You have 1,000 employees, all getting access to this podcast. Well, through the first 6 or so episodes, can we at least get a 10 to 20% adoption, 100 to 200 people listening to this podcast, if it's not a strict requirement across your organization? And then over time, what we're looking to do is extend that into engagement, feedback, and trust. We want to engage with folks. We want feedback, which is critical to not only improve the show, but improve the organization. And trust, depending on who's hosting the show and what the goals are from maybe a strategic point of view. Are we trusting the C-suite team? Are we trusting management, product team, et cetera, et cetera? Which is not so different from a public podcast. When and if you're launching a public podcast, how do we get to our first 100 downloads? How do we integrate this into our content marketing? everything else you do around your podcast is what's going to make it successful. So you're, locking in and engaging with your existing content marketing efforts, newsletters, other media. Shoot for a goal. What's our first 100 downloads? Or, depending on what you're doing already with content, 100 downloads, 1,000 downloads, a million downloads. Depends on what you're already doing and what your footprint is in your content marketing already. And we're actually shooting for the same goal. And this is the overlooked part of podcasts is we want engagement, we want feedback, and we want trust from our audience. The same goal we want with our employees and our team in our different divisions across a brand. We want the same thing from the public side. We want to engage with our potential customers. We want that feedback. How can we improve the brand, the purchasing experience, the product? And do you trust us? Largely, we're putting out this content so that you're building out a trusted voice in the public, and we want our potential customers to trust us, right? It's a fantastic goal. Will your show be successful? We kind of look at it in three different ways. Now, again, there's no rules to podcasting. In our world, in Castos world, we have obviously podcast hosting. We have a productions arm as well, where we help brands and businesses of all sizes launch their podcast. Generally, that interview show or that private podcast to narrative podcast and to docuseries. We don't really get into the world of technical storytelling or, fiction, sound design, stuff like that. That's not our sweet spot. Our sweet spot is you have a goal, you have the content. How can we, build the team and the process around that to help you launch this podcast? If you're looking at your interview show or your private podcast, that's the easiest. It's the easiest to produce. You have a short time frame, a short budget. This is what you look to. You look to creating an interview show for both public and private. It's affordable. It's approachable content. So it's, up to you. Half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, 3 hours. Doesn't really matter. But we're going to look for engagement in the long run. So you want to keep it as tight as you possibly can. And then the cons is, well, if it's a public show, it's pretty competitive, right? Interview shows is the 95% of people that come through our door. So how can you be different, creatively, show format, marketing-wise? These are all things you have to think of. So there's a little bit more challenging. And if you're looking at it from a private podcast, is will my employees listen to this? I guess public and private. Success is in the host and the guest. I mean, interview shows live and die by the host and the guest that you're bringing on. So, when you look to Castos, say, hey, can you help with this? Well, certainly we can help you with the infrastructure, with the plumbing, with the busy work of a podcast. But that interview show, really going to live and die by your host. So that's very critical to narrow down in the beginning. A narrative podcast, an example is to check out one of a podcast that we produce, 3clipspodcast.com. This is a mix of an interview / narrative podcast. It's much more engaging. There's some sound design. There's some markers along the way, transitions. There's a bit of a script. There's a story arc for every episode. It's much more engaging content. Better for branding. Certainly helps put a brand, if this is a public show, into a stronger light. The challenging part here, it requires a strong theme. Like you really have to think about the content that you're putting together, the premise of a show. Certainly takes a larger budget to produce. If you're looking to produce something like this, it's just more people, more time, more thinking. And of course, it's a longer go-to-market, right? This is something that you don't launch in like a 30-day span. You really have to critically think about, how the show is formed. And then lastly, if you're trying to do some kind of docuseries, you have this great product, this great legacy of your brand, of your organization. That's the best of the best. The pros there is like, this is a story about you. The challenge is it requires very strong creative, the largest of budgets, premium storytelling, and the longest go-to-market. So sky's the limit. Really have to look at what your budget is and the time, and does that align with all the stuff that you're doing. At the end of the day, our favorite thing is marketing. Fail to plan, plan to fail. Marketing is a make or break moment for podcasting. regardless of your public show or your private show. When we're looking for that adoption for a private podcast, we need, again, you're looking for that average of 10 to hopefully 20%, 10 being your sort of average, 20% being really good at the start of a private podcast in terms of employee adoption. You need to get it wherever, your stakeholders can get it, wherever you can get into an email newsletter, a Slack channel, a quarterly town hall that's, hosted in a webinar format. You need to position the podcast in a place where your audience will see it. Obviously, imperative for a public podcast to be marketing a public podcast. Just, shipping the show and getting it out to Apple, Spotify, Podcast Index, all of these different places, that will not drive traffic to your show. Let's talk about internal launches. So, okay, Matt, you've kind of hooked me here. I understand I have to get this 10 to 20% adoption. What ideas do you have for me? This is some of the things that we've seen work with our clients for some internal launches of private shows is, of course, you have to get executive buy-in or stakeholder buy-in and encouragement. I know that's the hardest. In some cases, what is this podcast thing that you want to do? That's going to be obviously the first bet, the buy-in from the C-suite team, the executives, stakeholders. Of course, if you can get that happening, the better chances you are in the long run. More people give you a little bit longer of a leash to do a podcast. Internal podcast website or blog, right? If you have some kind of internal, if there's a policy where you need to host internal content on a website, having the clear call to actions of what this podcast is about, clear show notes. Again, Castos can help with that. Nice, quick, easy, accessible podcast player, of course, on that website. Playlists, things like that. Very important. If you can get yourself in a newsletter, like I mentioned before, Slack, SharePoint, visibility, just asking to where you can get visibility across the organization to improve listens. And a fun one is sort of this launch party or private screening. This kind of goes hand in hand with executive buy-in. What we've seen in the past is if you can get, if this is an interview show and maybe interviewing the C-suite team or some of the decision makers, sort of doing this private screening, sort of butter them up a little bit to get that buy-in and encouragement, and do this private screening. Hey, we recorded the episodes, we've edited them together. Here's what you sound like, and here's how we stitched everything together. Do this sort of private screening, and then they sort of are more encouraged to share this at launch day. Or you do a launch party, a launch listening party, where you launch the show, you sort of get everybody on a Zoom or something like that, and you play the podcast sort of live, and everyone sort of gets to partake in that first episode or that first trailer episode. So, thinking outside of the box, thinking a little bit more creatively always helps. Public launches, everything's almost very similar. It's attached to existing content marketing efforts. It's just key that you are locked in with your blog, your newsletter, your social efforts, your YouTube or other video efforts. Public-facing blog or website, absolutely critical for a landing page, for a good-looking website to send your traffic to, of course, not only to consume the content, but to subscribe to the show and then maybe get on a newsletter would be another great call to action for your public-facing podcast. Integrating into your newsletter, either making individual newsletter sends for every episode, or at least linking a summary to it in your weekly, monthly, daily newsletter that you send out. Do you have a YouTube strategy? There's a lot of video crossover to audio these days. A lot of folks using things like, of course, Zoom, Riverside, Squadcast, Zencastr, record the video, and then extract the audio. Do you have a YouTube strategy? Being the second largest search engine in the world, are you putting your videos up there, which are dialing back to your audio podcast? And do you have a clear call to action on the show? Absolutely the most overlooked and undervalued thing is, do you have a clear call to action for every show? This goes back to the goal setting, but are you telling people to go to the website and subscribe? Are you asking them to join the newsletter? Or do you have value for joining the newsletter? Like, if I encourage you to join this newsletter, what do I get out of it? Do I get something special, something behind the scenes? Could tie into a private podcast, that kind of thing. having a clear call to action for every episode is imperative to measure the success and seeing if you're reaching those goals. Okay. A lot of information, so far. We're balancing between public and private for your brand or your organization. Let's just talk about budgets, set those expectations. What can you expect? Of course, there's no hard rule here. You can get away with things that are less expensive. You can get away with spending 10 times the amount. It's totally up to you. I'll just give it to you from what I've seen in the past and what I've recommended for our existing customers that we work with. So hardware budget, a starter kit for a private podcast, something, fairly startup interview podcast. You could spend anywhere between $150 to $500. If it's you and a co-host, your good podcast mic that plugs in through USB is about $75. You buy 2 of those, you're at $150. And you can get more stuff. You can get boom arms, and we have a whole bunch of other content. Maybe when we get into the Q&A, I can answer specific questions about hardware. But if you're looking at that starter level, anywhere between $150 to $500. If you want something a little bit more professional, or you're building an in-house studio, so you're getting, a specific office that's going to turn into your audio recording studio. You're getting boom arms, you're getting better mics, you're getting a mixer that you just hit record right there in person. You're not doing it over the internet. That's where you could go anywhere between $1,000 to $5,000. I mean, again, sky's the limit, but Rode makes a device called the Rodecaster Pro. I have to look that up after I stop presenting. And that's like a $400 or $500 device, and that plugs into 4, or you can plug into 4 microphones into that. And it's sort of this all-in-one podcast recording tool, and sort of mixes everything, makes it sound pretty good. And you can just put it in a room. You don't even need a computer. You can just plug all that stuff into it, hit record. And, that's $400 or $500 itself. Another $400 or $500 on microphones. Hey, you get boom arms. Maybe you get some sound dampening material. You start looking at that $1,000, $2,000 setup for an in-person configuration. And if you really want to excel with professional video and live streaming, minimally, if you're getting a good digital DSLR, Sony, some lights, a good microphone, for a one-person setup is at least $3,000, right? If you're getting a good lens, a good camera, getting the whole thing, you could be anywhere in the ballpark of $3,000, if not twice that. A lot of our gearheads out there will be nodding their heads up and down saying, yes, you could spend a lot more than that. So that's what you can expect on a scale of beginner to much more advanced. What does your annual productions budget look like? Like, what would it cost you if you were to outsource some of the busy work? At the real low end, if you were outsourcing to Castos Productions and you just needed some basic editing stuff, you didn't really need much. And an annual production of a show, if we're doing the busy work for you, is about $10,000. Obviously, it depends on how many episodes and what kind of edits you'd be looking for. If you're looking to produce something like a narrative style interview, or something that's a step up from your typical get two people on a call and just record it, again, if you have a producer and you have an editing team, anywhere but $30,000 for the year. Again, depends on how many episodes. And really, if you start getting into, at least with Castos Productions, you want to get into a documentary podcast, or you're doing some more complex audio, sky's the limit again, but a really advanced show might be around the range of a $55,000 investment for a 12-episode podcast. Your average hours invested in creating an interview show, if you were to just step back and say, hey, Matt, this sounds great, we might not be ready to invest in like a productions company yet. What we found is an average interview show is going to take you about 8 hours. If you minus 1 hour for the actual recording, you're now left with 7 hours, and you just think of like the logistics. You think about planning, you think about scheduling, you think about editing, you think about promoting, show note writing. All of those areas could, at minimum, take an hour. Maybe not the scheduling one, but the show writing, certainly the editing, all of the stuff, the promoting, creating the graphics around it, blogging, all of that stuff, about 8 hours on average for your typical, public podcast, and maybe even private podcast, depending on how much stuff you put into it. every episode could involve many people, up to 6 individual roles: a creative director, a podcast producer, a podcast host, the podcast editor, maybe a show note writer or a script writer or an editor for the words that go down onto the content, onto the page. And then, of course, a marketing lead who's going to, once this whole team of people go out and produce this podcast, who's going to go out and market it and promote it so that we can get it heard. Luckily for you, if you're thinking about investing in some productions, Castos can handle, 5 out of the 6 roles. We don't get into marketing. That's where we would lean on you. We can help polish off the final product and hand it to you, but we can help with pretty much everything else in producing that either public or private podcast. If your brand or your organization is really concerned about security and support, who isn't these days, specifically to Castos, if you're thinking, okay, I want to do this private podcast thing, I think we can sell this to the team, but we have a lot of security concerns. There's a lot of IT or InfoSec stuff we have to jump through to get something like this approved. That's okay. Just a quick overview. We have collaborative accounts. So if you need people with different roles, with different access, you can do that by default. We have single sign-on compatibility for our private podcasts. If you're using Castos iOS or Android app, we can set the audio to streaming only, so your end users can't download it. It's still audio. It's still coming out of a speaker. We can't stop people from recording sound coming out of their own devices, but we will try to protect the access to that content as best as we possibly can, which brings us all the way to if you have a really strict InfoSec team and they want content to be siloed and not in a multi-tenant situation, basically you're not sharing a server with other Castos customers, we can launch your podcast on its own server in your own AWS, Amazon Web Services region. That's the cloud provider that we use, and we can actually make those dedicated instances available to you. And of course, custom API access. If there's something you want to do with the content and the rules and access to the server, we can certainly support you with custom APIs. And in terms of support, help desk ticketing system across the board. It's pretty standard. Here at Castos, we will support the podcast access and uptime and questions around podcasting. If you are on one of our enterprise plans, a dedicated success manager is available, and bespoke launch package is available on all plans. So if you need help launching this podcast, strategizing it, a creative lead, we can put together a plan to help you launch your podcast. And then if you need ongoing services like editing and producing, show note writing, we can also take care of that for you as well. And then at the end of the day, you can get priority support across all of the plans. Thanks everybody for watching today's webinar. If you have any questions, if you are a brand or an organization, you're like, I want to launch a public podcast, I think this private podcast is also very interesting to me, feel free to reach out to us, hello@castos.com. Again, my name is Matt. We'll be taking a break and then jumping into some Q&A. If you're watching this video afterwards, just feel free to reach out to us, hello@castos.com, answer any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching, everybody.